part of this process is it was me coming up with a method to process trauma that I had without knowing about anything else that would help. And so part of it is actually kind of revisiting your previous self at critical junctures where things went really fucking south, and either like coming in when somebody should have stood up for you, and you imagine yourself walking into that space and standing up for your previous self. Or you know that if you'd gotten a particular kind of support, maybe it wouldn't have had as much downstream effects. And so it's going back and really putting yourself in that space in your imagination and going, hey, that was fucked up, but we're okay. And so you can let it go. And I have all that shit you're hanging on to right now because I know how to process it now.
Welcome to the Repatterning Podcast, where we believe your mind-body system is your domain and that choosing the beliefs, habits, and patterns that best support you is your birthright. I'm your host, Arden Leigh, creator of the Repatterning Project, an 8-week course in learning to free yourself from the patterns of your past and program your mind for your dreams of the future. Join me for these extraordinary conversations as we unpack the keys to creating our reality. Welcome back to the Repatterning Podcast. I'm your host, Arden Leigh, and I am so excited to welcome today's guest, Aidan Wachter. Aidan is a practicing witch and animist, and also the author of 3 books, 6 Ways, Approaches and Entries for Practical Magic, Weaving Fate, which I have my copy of right here, Hypersigils, Changing the Past and Telling True Lies, and Changeling, a book of qualities. I'm really excited to chat with Aidan today because when I started reading some of his work, I recognized so much simpatico between Aidan's approach and the approach of the Repatterning Project, which is the 8-week course that I teach that inspires these conversations on this podcast. And by the way, if you're listening, chances are we are presently enrolling for the next session. You can check us out more at therepatterningproject.com, or you can go on Instagram to @the Repatterning Project, and you can find out the details of enrollment there. And what I really, really love about Aidan's approach is that it feels to me like the very witchy, sensory-based, right-brained approach to the same truth that the Repatterning Project arrives at from a very analytical, logical, left-brained approach. So one of the reasons I'm so excited to have Aidan on today is that I want as many people to understand this sort of basic truth of reality and human nature and life and magic and agency, as many people as possible to be able to access that deep spiritual wisdom. So I really hope that today's conversation with Aidan might help some of the folks who maybe resonate more with that more organic and right-brained approach to understand some of the things that I've been sharing on the show already. So Aidan, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm super excited to chat with you today.
It's excellent to chat with you. It's been a while since we have, so it's super nice.
It has. Aidan, you guys, Aidan has been a guest teacher in my advanced container twice. I was extremely honored to welcome him. And he's blown everyone's minds each time he comes in and chats with us. So I'm really excited to talk with him today, too. I definitely want to start off with the first book of yours that I personally read, which is Weaving Fate, Hypersigils, Changing the Past, and Telling True Lies. And I was reading in the beginning where you're talking about deconditioning and stripping away some of the beliefs that we get conditioned with over time, or that there are moments in our past that form. And I just want to start with that, actually. Maybe can you tell people maybe about what your approach was, or the approach that you guide others through in order to do that work?
Yeah, so I came to that. You've been around me, so I'm going to background everything.
Please do.
I was thinking about this in relationship to this conversation because I know what you do, and I listened to the Grant Morrison and Doug Rushkoff things to see how you were running things. They were both great.
Oh,
So
thank you. Oh, I'm honored. Thank you.
how I got into magic was through punk rock, and I met these anarchist dudes who were a couple years older than me, and one of them was a magician, and they were all way more into kind of industrial music at that time, and this would have been 82. And one of the guys, it may have been a more general discussion, but I remember one of those guys turned me onto this idea that he referred to as tape loops. And the best way that for people now is before there was sampling and before there was digital sampling and all that stuff that we just take for granted now. If you wanted to do that kind of thing in music, you would actually record a looped sound of something like an instrument or a vocal, and then you would play it on tape decks. And so this was what tape loops were. And that just stuck with me. And the more, as it was kind of in the back burner until I got heavily into magic. And then as I was doing that, I began seeing people who ostensibly knew what they were doing and had way more kind of book knowledge than I did, but I could watch them running these loops that were to me really counterproductive to the work of magic.
Oh boy, that
That
is a whole mood.
right, that you're like, "Oh, you're really stuck on it has to go exactly right, or it has to go exactly this way." And so if you try to light a candle in a ritual and the lighter is not cooperating, you lose your shit. And to me, that was crazy because it's like, you've got to be way more resilient than that, right? It's like, what if you never get it lit? Does that mean you can't do magic? To me, that's fucking absurd, right?
Yeah.
And then just consistently over time, I would have moments where I would be doing something and I would realize, like, I don't know why I'm doing it, except that there's a little voice that's telling me, like, you're doing it cause, but that's part of the loop.
Mm,
It's part of the program. And so you could kind of interrogate it for why, and it would come up with all sorts of whys, but it was really clear that they were all empty. Like the why was really just because it's what we've done before, it's what we've been taught to do. And I could see this in most people that I knew in a very unquestioning way, particularly like teachers and parents and folks like that. Because I got into this stuff when I was quite young. And so I began thinking about it then, but I don't think I really got a handle on it until I was reading, I think probably for the second time, the Amber books by Roger Zelazny. Have you read those? Nine Princes in Amber.
I have not actually. I've not even heard of those. That's
Oh,
so I might
the
have to check
first
that out.
it's Nine Princes through the Courts of Chaos are the good ones. And anyway, I was already practicing pretty heavily. I'd read it before I got serious, but I know at this point I'd been practicing and was considering myself a chaos magician at that time. And the thing that's really interesting in those books is there's reasons behind it, but some of the characters can basically walk between worlds, and the way that they do it is they like get on a horse or they walk or they get in a car. And as they're traveling, they go, okay, but what if the ocean was not on my right? And they could have it shift to the other side.
Huh.
And they could do this and kind of move between kind of planes of existence. And to me, this was a great description of magic. Like we begin to remove the things that aren't correct for us and replace them with things that are closer, and eventually we end up in a completely different world, in a completely different life. So that's what was kind of the roots of all of that stuff for me.
I actually want to read just a couple paragraphs from Weaving Fate that really particularly moved me. Is that all right with you?
Yeah, absolutely.
This is the stuff that when I read this, it just it really clicked for me so much, and I was like, you know how when they say like a lie like can manifest in a thousand different ways, but the truth always has sort of the same ring to it. This is how I felt reading this part of your book. So, I'm just going to share this with our audience. If we can move and shift ourselves free of these locked down and rigid belief structures, we can return to something like a native or intrinsic state. This is a way of being that existed before the desires of others became our own, before all of life was mediated and sold back to us. From this intrinsic state, we can begin to live a life that fully suits us as we are today, right now, not what we came up with when we were 16 and we were told we had to decide who and what we would be when we were all grown up if we were offered a say in it at all. Making these shifts is to begin steering our fates, to become co creators of our lives alongside the weavers. If we wish to change the outcomes we experience, to alter the trajectory of our lives, we are best served by changing it at the roots of the tree, at first causes, rather than attempting to conjure different fruit or ends directly. We do this by addressing those causes which produce the effects already in play that we wish to modify. This allows us to shift or transform them into powerful drivers that lead to more suitable outcomes or states of being. By altering important points along the trajectory of our lives, we can achieve different end states. Much of what we base our current experience on are memories of the past. We recall what has happened before, interpret it as good, bad, or neutral, and we extrapolate from those memories to see where we are likely to end up next. These past experiences often dictate what we believe about ourselves and our situation, which helps to form what we think of as our self identity. From a sorceress perspective, our identity controls not only our current position, but our sense of what is possible, and so our future outcomes as well. I just got chills reading that again, even though I've read it many times already. Tell me a little bit about how you arrived at that conclusion of deconditioning for yourself.
So I came in to magic through the Temple of Psychic Youth. And the Temple of Psychic Youth was started by Genesis Purage and Peter Christopherson as a project they did after Throbbing Gristle broke up. And there was always this deconditioning element in there. And I'd had the experience so I found that when I was 15 or 16. And around the same time, I also took part as the youngest person that had ever been allowed in to an EST offshoot kind of encounter group weekend where he was also addressing this kind of stuff directly. Focused a bit more, of course, not on what would be interested in, but given who was kind of had the money to do this in general, it was more business folks and kind of that usual thing that you get out of that stuff. And what I figured out from watching that was I could like look at my parents and go, okay, and later in life ask them, it's like, how much of what you did you decide on? And they were like, "Well, all of it." And you're like, "No, no, no, no. Like, how much did you actually sit and think and go, I want to do this life like this?" And both of them were like, "Never." And I was like, "Ah, okay, this is what's wrong with me, right? This is why I'm not fitting in because this is super critical to me. Like, why would I want that?" And some of those things I did want, and I still asked that. Like, okay, I want to be, I was super neurodivergent, weird, nerdy punk, stoner kid, way more interested in music and science fiction than anything else. And all of that, I just think led to sending me down that. Like, why do people want what they want? And I believe it's almost entirely conditioning. And essentially, there's like a good form of social conditioning and there's a bad form, right? And the good form is what we see in what most of the places we see it now are what we would call indigenous cultures that have managed to hold on to it. But the language that I prefer to use is like functional society.
Hmm.
And to me, a functional society is one that everybody in it is functional and not productive. That's different. That's, capitalism speak. But that they're okay. Like they know who they are, they know where they are. And within those kinds of cultures in functional societies, you have all of these stories that explain where you live, what your interrelationships with the landscape are, with the animals, with ecology, and with the spirits, with the dead, with each other. And what I could see and still see here is that we don't have any of this. We have kind of everything is production aspiration. And so nobody, and I think this is why people are so crazy, not necessarily in a clinical sense, but that too is because we're looking for ground that it doesn't exist within our culture. And we know on that intrinsic level that are reading about what that is and what it would feel like. And so we have this huge amount of like loss and grief and no way to process it because it's never even addressed as being relevant. Or if it is, it's in really shitty ways. It's, nationalism and statism and corporatism. Are you pretty enough? Are you wealthy enough? All these things that shouldn't matter. But we have a totally dysfunctional society. And so to me, all that is programming. And a big part of the work of magic for me, because I believe that magic is an innate thing within us, is getting rid of enough of that, or at least getting to where you can see it and pick and choose, that you can actually get to that state where you can do magic. Because otherwise, you're doing like the wrong things for the wrong reasons. And this is, I think, the biggest issue that I see for folks that are kind of drawn to spiritual practices is often they're not given a real understanding of like what that would even be for. It's like super vague. And if you could kind of go, well, hey, maybe it's to get you operating outside of those programs or at least choosing them because some of them work, some of them are very good. It's not necessarily, it's arguable that some spiritual systems are seeking to get outside of all of that. But I would argue that they have their own cultural conditioning within those systems because it still has to fit that model or they don't accept it. And so to me, that's kind of the most baseline piece of magic is like, can you get control of yourself and control of your situation, at least enough to know what you think about the situation you're in for real, that's not mediated, it wasn't fed to you.
Yeah, I feel like it's a very difficult point to get across to a lot of contemporary occultists. I just read actually just the other day, Matt Oren shared a quote from Christopher Penczak, and I didn't prepare it, so I'm paraphrasing. But essentially, what that quote said was the external things that we can get through magic, a new job, a new lover, like those are great. And, but really, what I respect most deep down is people who do the spiritual work to change not their external circumstances, but themselves to gain more confidence, to gain, a sort of spiritual grounding and sense of calm, and to be able, if you change yourself, you're going to change the way that everything that you interact with, and I believe that that really is what repatterning is about, and there's plenty of ways, both mundane and magical, to rewire the brain and change your own inner state of being, which is, primarily what I teach. And I always tell people, I really think take the first 7 years of your practice and make sure every sigil that you cast starts with the word I. Change yourself first. And then, after that point, and I'm not saying don't open your roads to certain outcomes or whatever, sure, give yourself
Mhm.
the things that you want. But before you try and control anything else in your external reality. And I find it so difficult to get that across to so many occultists who, let's face it, a lot of people in the occult world are more than a little bit unhinged and are stuck in these sort of power grabs. I have magic, I'm going to use it to control and dominate things. And if you're trying to tell me to be a little goody two shoes over here and just work on myself, that's not interesting to me. Not only is it not interesting, but I kind of think you're a wuss for, not going
Yeah.
out and grabbing that. Yeah. How would you communicate what we're speaking about to that archetype of person? Because man, I have tried.
So I have like I tend to hit a problem in there anyway, with folks that are wired that way because I'm a hardcore animist. And so for me, animism is not metaphorical at all. I'm fully immersed in a world that I have very, very regular spirit contacts and have for years. They're verifiable in that what they suggest is not what I would tend to do a lot of the time without
I
having
get that
some
too.
guidance. And if I do that, things work. And then they often connect through other people to me. Like they will have other people tell me things because I'm not the most clairvoyant person. So, like, I have a good friend that will periodically call me up and go, hey, these people you work with, they want this on the altar. And like when I bring it to them, it's really clear that's true. And it's just like I'm not clear enough in that particular way. That's not a skill I have to pick up on. So those folks tend to have an issue with me anyway, because they also tend to be very materialist, even if they do on some level kind of buy in that there's something else going on. They're viewing it in a materialist way, I think. But how I talk about it, so by the time this comes out, I'll be running a course on kind of building a practice in the way that I suggest for people. And the first document kind of talks about what we just said, and how I kind of define it is a PDF called Playing Records. That's the first thing you get when you get in there. And it's basically saying, like, okay, what we tend to do is operate like a vinyl record, or for modern people, like a playlist, right? It's track 1 through 800, and you tend to hang out in maybe the top 30, and they kind of recursively feed into one another, right? If that's going on, you don't know what you want. You think you do, but you know what you were programmed to want. And that's the issue with that approach. Because it's like if you don't do that work, you're trying to fill a void without knowing the shape of that void and without knowing the depth of that void. And so that kind of self-knowledge is hugely important. And one of the great things about results magic is it's a really rough road, but it's a great teacher of all the things that aren't satisfying. And so for everybody that quits at 5 years in or 10 years in because they are still unsatisfied, it's like I think they missed the turnoff.
Mm,
And the turnoff is at some point is going like, wait a second, if I can manifest all this stuff and I'm still not happy, what's up?
yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, you're manifesting something that isn't what the actual thing that you need is. But it's a hard sell because people we're way certain I think we get entrenched about things that we feel certain about because we have like an emotional attachment to that. It's like what we were talking about at the beginning. Like like I just would never create a ritual that's done outside that requires me starting a fire. If that's the key point there, do that inside, right? Because it's like, why are you going to set yourself up to fail?
Mm,
There's a million ways you could do a ritual for the same thing. There's no singular path. Yeah, so I think it's interesting. And I also think it's tough because there is a reality that we do need to have enough of the stuff that is socially and culturally required to get by. But you have to also find a way to get some space from that if you possibly can. So that in those spaces you can go, okay, but what's real to me? What do I really need here? And I think a lot of people just never get there because they don't get the space. And I also think people like now, especially, people don't get what practice is when it comes to spiritual stuff. And that's the course that I'm teaching is called Building a Practice because it's
nice.
about that, because it's this exact thing we're talking about. It's like if you sit down and do a particular kind of energy working once, you had an experience, but it doesn't do anything. 30, 40, 50, 100 times down the road, you've changed your neurology. That's what practice does. It's and this is why, people are super fascinated by spells and rituals and sigils, and they aren't great at that thing. They aren't the best tool to rewire what's going on up here. And coming from kind of an animist perspective, for most of us that aren't super psychic by nature, and a lot of us just don't get there, until you do some of that rewiring, you don't get contact with the other things. And that's what's
Mm,
really useful to me. So, like, I start everybody off making offerings to allies. It's like, we don't care. That's number one. You don't need to know who they are now. You don't need to know who they are ever. It's like the assumption is if you're alive and you're, older than 9, you have them because this is a sketchy planet for, animals. And so we just run on that as a given and start trying to build that relationship. And that's kind of the first thing that I run. And the funny thing about that is people will go, well, I'm an animist. And I'm like, it doesn't matter. This is a language, a way you can view it is that this is a language that your kind of deep mind, your kind of deep self understands. It doesn't have anything to do with whether you believe it. If you cut up a bowl of fruit and offer it to your allies with a candle every day, that's doing stuff in here. Even if you believe that all that's happening is just internal, the results are interestingly similar.
Yeah, I love what you also mentioned about how building a practice will change your neurology over time. And
Absolutely.
that for me has also been really huge, especially in the last few years. In my first several years of practicing magic, so much of my focus was on repatterning, on changing my beliefs. And I was maybe doing, I would pull cards, I would divine, and I would cast a spell maybe every couple months for something that I needed. And I would get results from that. And often those spells, as I said, were on myself. And in the last few years, my circumstances changed in some ways in that I began really building things. And there were also some situations in my life that required more regular and intensive magic that I was tackling. And in doing this, I ended up with a practice that, I still to this day maintain where I'm divining literally almost every day. And I know there are some occultists out there who will be like, "Oh, that's too much divination," but I'm in communication with my allies and I'm similar to you. I'm not psychic clairvoyant so much, but when I open up that space of divination, they'll give me messages right away. So as long as I'm sitting there at my table and got my cards and pendulum, I'll get those messages as long as I open that door. And the difference over time in the communication, the spirits that show up for me, and in my ability, I'm actually in many ways opening up my psychic development more than, without even really trying a lot of traditional psychic development practices. And I do try and practice some of those, but it's almost like the communication becomes so much clearer that I'm almost hearing what they say, and then I just confirm it with my pendulum to make sure it's actually what they mean and not just an intrusive thought. So yeah,
Right.
man, I so recommend folks that just doing things regularly, building that muscle. Yeah, a friend of mine on Twitter, Vizakon Virasamy, used to say, "Do something 100 times, and then just see what the difference is between your first and your 100th."
Yeah, and that was one of the things that I was really lucky on is there wasn't a lot of information out where I was. I didn't know a lot of people who practiced, and the first person that gave me a practice told me to do it twice a day for 6 months. That's, I think, really reasonable, and it's really tough for people to kind of wrap their heads around that, like, "You want me to do this, like, 350 times before we move on to the next thing?" And it's like, "Yeah." Like, if I had control, yes. And I ended up doing variations of that for close to 7 years, and there's no way that that didn't radically change me. You just can't. It's like practicing guitar. It's like, you're gonna be better if you put in that many hours. It's just what happens. And, yeah, for me, it's interesting too. It's like one of the things that, I'm aphantasic, so I don't have an internal screen. I can't visualize anything. So that's really tricky for a lot of the instructions for magic because a lot of it's visual. And it took me a really long time. It took me up until maybe like 10 years ago before I realized that I was getting body stuff. Like I would tremble and shake, and that would let me know that the allies were around. And it wasn't until about 3 years ago now where I was like, "Hey, could we actually go really hard on this? Could you focus on doing these body shakes and stuff?" And that's become like my pendulum now. I don't use the pendulum anymore because I can just kind of sit down and talk to them, and I will kind of like shake when they're now shaking is yes, and like more shaking is more yes, and less shaking is like you're warm but not right there. And if you're still, that's totally off base. And so I can have a conversation with them now that way that's very fast. And this is not a thing that's taught in any books on magic that I know of, which is too bad because we end up, it kind of goes back to that conditioning thing because so much of what we get about magic is visual, meaning that it's coming through visual media or visual descriptions. And then the people that can visualize, it's a really great tool for them. So they lean really heavy on it. And now, I mean, I think aphantasia was only really kind of recognized maybe 10 or 15 years ago. That like there's some of us that cannot do that. And so you got to figure out how are they talking to you? Because they probably are. And that's one of the things that I push people towards as well is like get really open. Like, what if you don't have to learn something new to do? You have to notice what's already happening. That's one of the biggest keys that I've found that is really helpful for all of this stuff. Because people go like, "Oh yeah, I have like these wild dreams that come true, but yeah, I just can't visualize, so I feel like I'm not getting anything done." It's like, go to the dreams. Forget that thing you can't do. Do the thing you can, and then ask them. And again, it doesn't matter if you view that as I do as outside of spirits, or if you view it as your own, deep mind or unconscious or whatever. Just say, "Hey, this works for me. Can we lean into this? Or can you be way louder?" Like, this is one of the best things that I ever did was like, yeah, I was getting little hints at stuff and it was driving me batshit. And then I actually did a really consistent thing that anytime any of that would kick up, I would be like, "Louder. I'm really dense." Like, louder. And it got so loud that I was like, "Cool. Can we back that off now?" But now they get like subtle is not the way to go, with me.
I love how transparent you are about aphantasia because I feel like in a lot of your books, especially in Changeling. So Changeling is another book of Aidan's, you guys, that I've read that is really really good. And especially in Changeling, you offer so many options for people who might not be able to visualize. And I'll say I am probably much more geared toward not quite clairaudience, and it's a bit like claircognizance, but it's like it's verbal. I'll hear language, not necessarily hearing noise or even hearing a voice, but the words will suddenly form. I have, some visuals sometimes, and especially the more I do, the more it opens up. But yeah, I think that would actually be a great question to lead into next is for listeners out there who do have aphantasia, what are some of the other channels or avenues that you recommend trying out?
So just because it's been such a huge one for me, try going into whatever you're doing ritually with no expectation, but pay attention to what happens. Because, like, one of the ones that I got early on that I recognized is like, if I kind of made contact to whatever you want to call it that we're interacting with when we do magic, there would be pressure changes in my ears, like being in an airplane. And that was one of the first things that I recognized, like, okay, so something's shifted in the room. And lean into whatever those are. Realize that you can talk your way through every exercise that's ever been created and actually just speak out loud what you're doing. So, like, if you're supposed to draw a pentagram in blue fire in front of you with your finger with a wand, state that that's what you're doing while you're doing it out loud. Like, I am drawing a pentagram of blue fire in front of me. That's the same imaginative process as seeing it, and the effect is the same. And this is wild for a lot of people that are just like, and it doesn't work if you don't speak out loud, or it doesn't work nearly as well. But that's a huge one. I also the thing that I tell people is like, okay, we have this general kind of belief that the people that can see everything all the time are super kind of blessed and know what's up. And what if just for you, if that's a thing that you've played with and you've done, and I suggest everybody see if they can get there because there's lots of good books out, like Christopher Penzak, who you mentioned earlier. Inner Temple of Witchcraft has a lot of great exercises that will help you get there if you can do that thing. But if you can't, reframe that and go, okay, so why do I believe this person that basically like is hallucinating all the time is witnessing things that are real and not just making it up? And maybe that's not a desirable thing. Maybe I would rather have it come in a different way. And I stuff that I started doing a real long time ago, probably within the first 2 years I started practicing. So it's now 40 years of this, is go to the altar and talk to whatever you think you're talking to, whether that's yourself or your allies, and tell them what you're trying to do. Not in a ritualized state, but go in, light your candles, do whatever you do some breath work or whatever, and then just start talking. Going like, hey, I would like to have better communication with my unconscious or with the spirits or with the allies or with the dead, whoever that is that you're trying to get and connect with. It would be really cool if we could figure out a way to do this. And don't propose a pathway. Just put it like hand it to them and go like, "Hey, you guys, this is the thing I want from you right now." And keep asking and usually something kicks up. But you don't have to ever see anything, you don't have to ever hear anything. A lot of people will develop, I guess, what is claircognizance. I have that in a weird form now where oh yeah, this is the other piece. Everybody thinks what's gonna happen is gonna happen in the ritual, and I think that's just wrong. Like, it's putting this really micro container on things that are usually really big. So you do the ritual, nothing happens, awesome, move on. And if you keep doing that, what tends to happen is whatever way you're gonna get information starts to open up because you aren't kind of derailing the process when you're, like, not getting what you think you should be getting. So it's very frequently that I will ask at the altar and be like, "Hey, I would like this to be like this," and I don't expect anything. And a day, 2 days, 2 weeks, a month later, I know something that I didn't know. And it's not because I read it, and it's not because 'cause I've been thinking about it. It's because whatever is this system that we call magic has gone, okay, here's your solution. Here's your answer to that thing that you asked. And that's completely legit. And you can test it, right? It's like, I'm not protesting in the sense that a lot of people are like, oh, I'm going to do all these experiments to prove that magic works or doesn't. But see what happens if you act on that stuff. But go into it really lightly, not like this is a scientific experiment. But if they say, oh, yeah, you should probably go to this place, go. You don't have to ask questions about it and see what happens. All this stuff opens up, but it takes time and it takes relaxing more than it takes work and will, is what I would say. It takes practice and then relaxing.
You bring up a really great point about asking for the things that you want to happen. And I know that for me, I've also been able to improve my practice by casting on my own abilities. Like just yesterday, which was a Monday, I cast my regular lunar divination spell, which I think I do like once a quarter now just for maintenance. And it's for clear, strong pendulum swings, accurate card pulls on the first try, and accurate, correct interpretations, and to open up my spirit perception. And it has worked. Like you cast these over time and you keep building up, and it will happen one way or another. And I also love what you shared about, because I've had that experience too, where you do the ritual and you're like, well, nothing really happened. I had that experience actually with an exercise that Grant gave me once. Grant and I, our apprenticeship is built on the Kabbalic tree of life, and we were in the sphere of Yesod. So Grant assigns me meditate on the dark side of the moon, like literally put on the Pink Floyd album and meditate, do like a lunar meditation. And sure enough, I'm sitting there and I'm listening to the dark side of the moon, sitting on my bed. I've lit some, jasmine incense or whatever. I'm like, all right, what's going on? And nothing really happens. And I'm like, well, okay. And then before I fall asleep, I find myself somehow navigating, like for some reason I got the urge to look up glossolalia on YouTube. And I found this woman with a video and it's got like 50K views on it. None of her other videos have a lot. And she's kind of like, she's like hanging out in a tent. She does not look like the most mentally stable person. She's like, I've been crying all day. Sorry, I look weird on video or whatever, but here's the glossolalia, whatever. And I just like and I followed to her blog. She's got like a blog. So I click on it. I'm like, I wonder when's the last time this person wrote something. And I look and it's, oh, today's date. Wow, she updated today. And another entry today's date, and another entry today's date, and another. And there's like five or six. I'm like, wow, this is every date has like, and she starts narrating these sort of internal like voices. She's hearing this, she's hearing that, and she's like, and I have these forces that are operating in me that are telling me to stalk this person, and I know I have to not listen to those forces, and I know that there's this over here telling me to do this, and I told this person just block me because I'm not going to be able to control myself. And the amazing thing, Aidan, was that this reading through this blog and seeing these patterns and weirdly enough recognizing some of my own neurodivergence and like her
Hmm.
anxious attachment, her pattern recognition, things like that. And I was like, wow, like this could have been me if I just like taken that wrong turn at Albuquerque kind of a thing. And that was the beginning of my foundational knowledge that allowed me to later understand DID, dissociative identity disorder. And it was and
Hmm.
nothing happened during the meditation, but immediately afterward, I found that, yeah. So I'm 100% on board with that. That just reminded me of that story.
It's super interesting because I think that a lot of people come to magic because they're aware that what we're told we should want and kind of the general experience of life is pretty hollow. But I don't know that a lot of magic is really kind of addressing this stuff. It's why I've kind of been to the side of most things most of my life. I've connected with different groups briefly at different times, but I've never been able to maintain it because I've always been very interested about not in the kind of conspiracy, what's really going on thing, but like, how do I need to be in the world so that I'm fully well, regardless of what's being offered? Like, what is that? And magic has helped me get there more than anything else. But for me to let that happen, I had to not care what other people said it was for. And so, like, people are like, "Well, what's your definition of magic?" It's like, I don't really have one.
Mm,
I can make one up for you, but it's not really about that, you know? And I think that if we look at stuff like DID, And I've had, when I was young, like kind of 15 to 18, I had a couple of really severe drug experiences that had me in similar states. And they were really useful because they showed me where I could go. And I had enough kind of consciousness, even in the experience, to be like, wow, this is really wild. Like, I'm really out of control here. And this is available. Right, this is a thing that can just happen. And yes, I did things that to make this happen, and hopefully it will stop in a day or 2, you know? But other people, that just happens, and it gave me a lot of compassion for the folks that I knew that were having a much rougher ride, you know? And so, looking at kind of weaving fate is really playing with this idea of, yeah, what's the core story that you're attached to? Or what is the core family stories or whatever, and are they working for you? And not even from the point of view of then let's go interrogate it. It's like not about the psychological approach. It's like, okay, what would work? What would a good life look like for you? And don't get weird about it. Don't get like crazy about it. All has to be perfect, or if I ask for the things I want, my grandmother will die or whatever, you know. There's all this anti-magic mythology even within folklore and magic. And all of that is I believe social control. I think every bit of that is social control. And that's not to say that you can't do some damage with magic, because you can. But you know what I tell folks that come into kind of my zone bringing that up, it's like, have you ever tried like walking outside? Like that shit's dangerous. Like it's way more dangerous than magic. You know, people are driving, like Jesus, you know, worry about that. Don't worry about if asking for what you need is going to cause somebody else to have a really tragic end. It's like it's not. The world's not built like that.
Yeah, one of my musical collaborators who is not a magical person, but has I've done some magic for him. He's seen some results from me. It's sort of expanded his mind. But he said to me like, "Oh, I don't want to do magic because I've seen the movies and it always like turns out bad." I'm like, "Okay, well in that case, I've seen movies too, and I'm not getting in your car with you because I've seen movies about cars. They always crash."
Well, and that's also it's funny because it's like it's one of the things that I have that for folks that don't know, weaving fate is kind of a journaled approach to hypersigils, which is something that you've talked about with
I was
Grant.
gonna say we've got to talk about hypersigils.
And so I kind of came up with this particular iteration because of, though I didn't know about kind of Grant's experience with them at the time, I found that out much, much later. The people that I knew who were writing fiction as that kept trying to write stuff that was exciting. And that's not good. Like usually that's bad. Right? So you write about, you know, tragedies and overcoming tragedies. Well, then you're like asking for the tragedy to overcome, right? Do you want that? And so the journaling thing is usually a much easier way. And so the black book is really this journal about allowing yourself to like ritually fantasize about a perfect day, a perfect future, a perfect life, yourself way less fucked up, yourself way happier, and actually treating it as a magical act and as an enchantment, and doing other stuff that helps that along. And it's weirdly effective. It really is. It's I think it's a fascinating thing to have put out there because kind of a huge number of people have reached out. Like maybe a couple hundred people have reached out since Weaving Fate came out and said, "I read this book and basically thought this guy's like repackaging The Secret." And I put it away for like 3 years until things got really bad, and then I actually did what you said, and I did all 3 parts of it, and holy fuck. And it's like, yeah.
Yep.
Uh, like, that is how it seems to be. And that's a big part of, I think, your work too, as far as I understand it, which I think may be tough for people to get. It's like it clicks when it clicks, which is what you expect to happen and what you believe is possible, either in the world or for yourself, are like hard rails that keep you within that reality. And I'm not kind of going full on reality transurfing stuff. Like, I'm not talking about like we're going to somehow jump tracks into a different reality because most people I don't think will ever do that. I'm not saying it's impossible. I don't know. But I do know that if you actually believe that you're like doomed to repeat your parents' life or the last 10 years of your own, you probably will.
Yeah.
And so you better get on it. And so Weaving Fate is really the book about my approach to getting control of that thing and going, no, we're not doing that way. We can see that trajectory and no, and I think it's fun too. It's a fun process, which is always good.
Oh, absolutely. And I have my black book sitting right there over there on the shelf, and
I have one
I
over
will
here.
yep, I will also confirm just it works. Just, just do it and it works. But I do wanna come from another side of the coin though regarding, because I have my band Arden and the Wolves and I write,
Yeah,
I use my music as a way of hypersigilizing, of transmuting reality. And my feeling about writing about tragedy is it's really important to, especially as an artist, you really want to make sure that you don't get into a loop where you're rewarded with audience attention for your pain and then so you seek more pain out. But my feeling on this is there is enough pain in the world already. I can take pain that is already out there and I can transmute it. And that's what I most hope to do. And I think, also my own neurodivergence, my ADHD, my dopamine deficiency, I'm really into problem solving. There's just, that engages me. And so there are things that in my own life or in the lives of my loved ones that I've looked at and, looking at. And I remember actually like when you were in my advanced container, like, oh God, it was oh, you recommended feeding your demons. That was it. And I have to tell you, by the way, that really helped set me up with a practice that was really, really helpful for that particular situation. And I've used a lot, so I was, just for people who don't know, because they weren't there when Aiden and I were talking in that class. I was basically, I'd had a loved one make a cry for help to me, and I was looking to sort of get them out of a really difficult cycle and situation that they were stuck in, and which was kind of a really, really stuck situation because coping mechanisms like denial and avoidance are coping mechanisms, and often like we use those as a way of avoiding the pain because it's actually too difficult to go into, so you have to somehow create safety enough to even go there before you can, and getting someone to even kind of show up for that can be very difficult if the trauma is that extreme. So yeah, I've used my music in a lot of ways to write happy endings to existing tragedies because I'm like
that's
there's enough in the world already, you might as well.
I think that's a really great use for it, and that's kind of where I go, even with black book stuff. Is it's like there's a lot of work in the corridor and in the black book that kind of addresses this, which is it's like, and so for people, what the part of this process is, it was me coming up with a method to process trauma that I had other without knowing about anything else that would help. And so part of it is actually kind of revisiting your previous self at kind of critical junctures where things went really fucking south. And either like coming in when somebody should have stood up for you and kind of you imagine yourself walking into that space and standing up for your previous self. Or if it's something that makes sense. You kind of have to figure out what makes sense for you. Maybe something bad happens to that person, and which is you, and you know that if you'd gotten a particular kind of support, maybe it wouldn't have had as much downstream effects. And so it's going back and really kind of putting yourself in that space in your imagination and going, hey, that was fucked up, but we're okay. And so you can let it go. And I would like some of that. Like, let me have it. Can I have all that shit you're hanging on to right now? Because I know how to process it now. And so I think that you can transmute so much stuff. And that's again, I think we have like kind of a pretty big disservice has happened around magic being overly focused on either kind of individual, kind of solar, I am the center of the universe magic, or kind of like really like almost clinical results magic instead of what I'm interested in, which is like, can I make everything work better? Like,
Yes.
I don't just wanna go in and kind of put out fires or see if I can, get the next $5,000 that I need because my car blew up. Can I make it so that this is never an issue again? Or as close as I can get. Or when it kicks up, I'm just cool with it. Like, yeah, shit happens. Let's fix it, you know? And magic is great for all this stuff. It's just about changing what the target is. And so I love what you shared about that too, because at some point I stopped focusing the work outside and turned it on myself, as you described, and that's when everything started going way better. You go like, okay, this is a pretty good technology for getting stuff done in the outer world, but it's a fantastic technology for doing stuff on the inside.
I wanna talk about the corridor as well because the corridor exercise, that was another thing that when I read it, I was like, that is almost again, in the same way that, like, there is that same sort of tuning fork true ring of, like, truth, like, it all feels, very similar to one another. It was so almost functionally identical to, I'm pointing to my certification on the wall back here, to my timeline therapy certification, which is so fun. That was, like, part of my neurolinguistic programming certification, but I read the card, I was like, this again, it's a more right-brained, more story-based orientation to what I do in timeline therapy, which is, you go back to that moment that the pattern set, that the trauma happened or whatever incident or event happened, and you give yourself the support you need and you
Yes.
walk yourself through that or you walk the client through that or what. So I would love for you to share with our listeners a little bit about how to do the corridor exercise because I think it's so great that people can do that on their own as well.
So the corridor just happened. It's something that happened one day. I basically learned how to trance because I was an insomniac. And I was like, okay, if I'm awake from 3 o'clock until I go to work every night or go to work in the morning, I'm just going to do deep relaxation because that way I will actually be functional, right? And from that process, I learned how to trance. And in trance, I remember it was one night. I don't remember when though, and I was super relaxed. And some really fucked up event that had happened in my life popped into my head, and I was like, "Oh, I wonder if I could go there." And so I visualized this corridor, and it was just like an office hallway, like an office building hallway with doors on either side. And I was just walking down this thing for a long time. It felt for like 10 minutes or something, door after door. And I was just waiting for the door that led to that event. And I got a hit that, like, this one. And I walked in, and I like walked in as like the camera observer of the event, and watched that whole thing go down and kind of had my thoughts about it. And then it kind of just stopped or faded out. I don't remember exactly. And I went, I wonder if I can actually engage with that part of me, which is really the memory of the event, kind of the trauma memory of that event. And so I left the room and came back in and stopped it and was like, okay, I want to talk to you. That asshole is not involved. And got this completely engaged, much younger version of myself, like, what the fuck is going on? And me going like, you and I were the same thing. That guy's fucking unhinged. And you don't listen to a fucking word he has to say. And fuck him. And you're awesome. And this ended up being a process where I began going into that corridor and finding earlier moments, and I didn't plan them. It's like I would go in, find the door, and walk in, and I would be like, "Oh shit, this is one of the things that like really stuck." Like I didn't know, It's not like I went, "Oh, this event must have fucked me up." That's not how it went. I was very much running intuitively,
Wow.
and the biggest thing that I found was that either like shutting down the other person involved if there was somebody else involved immediately, or otherwise just like, this is what you're looking for and you will find it, but it's not right here. And so it's not a good place to look. But I'm around, I'm available. And so there were several years where there was a lot of corridor work going on in my life as I because it became that kind of thing where I had a sense that like my younger self was calling me now, like it knew. It remembered it had ingrained in that this was reality and would call me. And we were usually outside somewhere and be like, I don't know what to do about this. And that's when I realized that, like, oh, there's some other shit we could do here. Like, do you want to know how to do magic? Like, I learned how to do magic, but you could know now. Like, you don't have to wait till you're older. Like, do you want to know how to do sigils? Do you want to learn how to do some shit? And I began teaching myself magic in that space. I think it was to me, it's super useful work, and I think it's the most beautiful work that I've done magically because it was just 100% like what's needed here, and it's very rare we actually get to do what's needed in a situation. And so to me, like discovering that I could actually go back and actually have real effects from that, because that's one of the things that's so weird about it, that's hard for people to grasp is they go, okay, but how do you know that it worked? And in some cases, what I discovered was like, I wouldn't know what the effects of doing these corrections would be, or teaching this person magic. But then, like, I would be in a situation where somebody would push all of my buttons that would just wreck me and nothing happened. And it's like, "Oh, okay. That's all from these things that I've been changing." It's fascinating work. And that's why I also said that I think Weaving Fate is my best book practically. I think it's the most useful book, but I think view it as fun. Like, find the fun in the process and let it just play out, because it's like it's fascinating what happens. And I've been saying for a couple years now that I'm functionally living a life that is like a it's like if we were to go into Grant Morrison territory, if we were to go into like comic book territory, you have like the story of this is the one life, right? And then there's another one that's really close but better. Like, I'm living a black book that I wrote years ago, and I can see it. And it's not exactly the same. So that's why I tell people, like, you don't have to be precise. This isn't a precision act. It's like, get all the feelings right. And I basically, for about 3 years now, have been operating within that. And it's like, okay, this was all of that work in the corridor and the black book, and things just work now.
The other really cool thing too, and I think you mentioned this in Weaving Fate, is that there were instances in which you went back and altered an event on your timeline, and the memories in other people's minds were altered in the same way.
Yes.
I wanted to share with you because I'm having on the same season of this podcast, I've invited Mitch Horowitz on as well. So I just
Oh,
recently
excellent.
read his book, Daydream Believer, and he talks about doing this, at
Yeah.
least something very similar, and where he gave a speech, a presentation that he didn't feel was quite his best. So, like, I'm going to go back. I'm going to choose something that's fairly low stakes. I'm just going to imagine that I gave a really great. And he said, as soon as he did that, they posted the speech online. People in the comments were like, oh my God, this was fascinating. He said this was unprecedented. The folks who hired him sent him flowers afterwards. He said no one had ever done that after any of his other speeches. I just find that
It's
fascinating,
the
right?
weirdest thing because what happened with that was, I had changed something that happened back. I think I was already out of high school because I left high school early, but I was still living kind of in my neighborhood. It was before I moved to the city, and some shit went down that I didn't feel good about, and so I changed it, and there were other people involved, and so I corridored it and changed it. And, a friend of mine was performing in San Francisco. I was living in, I think, New Mexico at that time, and, maybe Seattle, I don't know, probably Seattle. And so I flew down and opened for him, and I was at the bar, and someone came up to me and started telling me like, "Hey, do you remember when this happened?" And I got like the truth chills
Yep.
before they opened their mouth, and I was like, "Holy fuck." And they fucking described something that I know is not what they experienced, but it is what I changed that in the corridor to be. What that
It's
is,
so
I don't
wild.
know. It's fucking fascinating though.
It really is.
Um,
Well, I wanna bring on our
yeah,
producer, Tommy, to ask her question as well, because I know we're getting to, we're getting around the hour. So,
absolutely.
Tommy, take it away.
Yeah, so Aiden, I know that you also come from a chaos magic background and that like Grant Morrison's work, like for so many of us, was one of your many gateways into this world. And I also know that that's not really a term you identify with anymore.
Hmm.
And I was curious if you could tell us a bit about like what that moment was for you when like what the last straw was where you realized that like this was no longer a term you quite associated with or wanted to identify with your practice.
Yeah, that's a great question. My best guess, I know what my thinking was, but I'm not sure exactly when it happened, is I think I just, like, hit a point where I'm like, "I don't actually think what's being described here is as close to what I think reality is," which is kind of this raw animist field, and I could see that a lot of the ideas in chaos magic were initially useful for me, but I diverged from them pretty rapidly. And particularly, I got super massively turned off with kind of the shift into kind of humorously. I didn't get into Morrison until much later, but kind of the shift into pop magic and Discordianism kind of rolling into chaos magic, and I had no use for it because by that point I was already like, oh, this is way more serious than people think. This magic thing, and I was only interested in it on that level. I wasn't interested in the other stuff. And so to me, it just became kind of it ceased to be accurate. I hadn't really discovered the idea of animism yet, but there was a point where I'm like, I'm not doing what people think I'm doing, and so I'm going to stop using that word. And I began to find also that, like every other label I've ever found, I just found that it was more of a bind than it was like a release from binds, and I don't have any use for that. So like I don't really have a self definition for what I do other than animist at this point. I use them and I make them up. Like I think I've been using witch thing in my bio for like a few years now, and I like that. But they're also kind of short-lived because I don't really they're not mostly not accurate, whereas the animist piece, that's accurate. And one of the things that I say a lot now is that I used to be a magical practitioner kind of working within an animist model, and at some point that ceased to be a model for me, and now I'm an animist who teaches through magic more than I teach magic. I do, but my subtext is not that you get better at magic exactly.
Hmm.
I want something for the world that's different than that.
Interesting. Yeah. I've not heard many accounts of people that have stepped away from chaos magic yet. So I really appreciate you sharing that insight of like where it stopped to mesh with your worldview and your view of magic.
Yeah, it actually kind of happened. It happened even when I was still in the IoT a million years ago, and then we formed the Z cluster after I left. Me and my friend Merrick did, and it was. I would say that the big dividing line for me was I like lost kind of all kind of interest in the kind of like we could do this with these pop culture figures, and I'm like, why the fuck would you do that when the reality is right there? Like it's palpable. These things are right there. They're ready to go. They are real. Why do you need to put a different face on it to make yourself comfortable? It didn't make sense to me. I'd rather be uncomfortable and be as close to the source as I can.
I imagine that's something that a lot of people see as like a point of accessibility for it, or like maybe it's just, yeah, the fun, the pop magic of it all, getting to put your favorite characters into these frameworks. But yeah, I feel like that
Yeah.
only works as like a first stepping stone, and like that'd be weirder for someone that's been in this for a while to then go like, hey, let's use this this superhero or this pop star or the
The other
K-pop
thing
demon
that,
hunters.
and one of the things that I've talked about in a lot of different places that this is related to is that I came to magic because I had experiences with spirits that were unquestionably that. And so I didn't come looking for spirit contact or proof of a spirit world. I came to figure out how you fucking lived with one, which was way different. And it was one of the first divisions I kind of made was there were a lot of folks that were kind of like, ah, is it results magic? Are you willing to curse people? All that. And I was like, none of this is relevant. It's like, are you doing this because you know? Or are you doing this because you want to find out? I knew. I just didn't know how to manage it. And so that was another big dividing line. That's still probably my biggest dividing line. Is that's those are the two divisions. There's people who come to this stuff because they think there's something there that could help them. And then there's the folks that come to it because they have to. because it's already there for them, and they have to come up with the tools to work with it appropriately, or it's going to eat their lunch.
Thank you. That I
Mhm.
think that gives me exactly what I was looking for.
Thanks for the question. It's a good one.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Aidan. It is always such a pleasure to chat with you. I know you and me are two of the folks who are in the magic scene who are the most vocal, I think, about hypersigils, you, me, and Grant. So
Yep.
it's really a pleasure to have you on and to chat about this. And by the way, you guys, if you want to check out more of Aidan's work, if you want to learn from him, you can go and support him on Patreon, patreon.com/Aidan Wachter. And of course, check out his 3 books, Weaving Fate, 6 Ways, and Changeling. And of course, check out the Repatterning Project. And you can come support us on Patreon too at patreon.com/the Repatterning Podcast. And hopefully we will see you in the next episode. Thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to the Repatterning Podcast. If you're curious about the Repatterning Project, the 8-week course in mental mastery and creative freedom that inspires these conversations, you can check out more details at therepatterningproject.com. We run a cohort twice a year, or you can download the self-study version of the course and get started today. We also offer a 4-week course on narrative magic and archetype titled Myths and Magic, Changing Your Life Through Story, also twice a year. If you'd like to join our community, the Repatterning Parlor, on Discord, you can sign up for $5 a month at patreon.com/the Repatterning Podcast. Thanks to everyone who makes the Repatterning Podcast possible. Firstly, our award-winning producer, Tommy Trembath of the Keymaster Collective network of podcasts. She also produces Transcending Comics, Vision in the Void, and Giant-Sized Violence. Thanks also to animation studio Mortis and Madriax, who created the video for our introduction, as well as to Andrew Means, who composed and produced our theme music. And also thanks to Al Alvarez, who took the photos of yours truly that you see on the cover of each episode if you're watching the video version. And finally, thanks to you, our listeners, who give meaning to this work. Our greatest wish is that whatever you've heard today inspires you to live freely and begin creating your reality from the inside out. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon.